It is the 14th of December, 1942, and inside a walk-in freezer at the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, a slab of ice the color of dirty concrete refuses to shatter. A man in a heavy coat swings a fire axe at it with everything he has got. The axe bounces off. He swings again. The ice barely chips. Behind him, a British scientist named Geoffrey Pyke watches with quiet satisfaction, because the substance being tested is not ordinary ice at all. It is a mixture of frozen water and wood pulp, roughly 14% sawdust to 86% water, and it is stronger than concrete, cheaper than steel, and its inventors believe capable of stopping a torpedo. Within weeks, this strange material will have a name, Pykrete, and a purpose that sounds like something from a fever dream. Britain is going to build an aircraft carrier the length of 2 football pitches, weighing more than 2 million tons, out of ice. The idea belongs to a moment of genuine desperation. In the winter of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic hangs by a thread. German U-boats are sinking Allied merchant ships faster than British and American shipyards can replace them, and there is a vast, murderous gap in the middle of the ocean where no Allied aircraft can reach to protect the convoys. Land-based bombers and fighters simply do not have the range. Steel is desperately needed for warships, tanks, and landing craft, and there is not nearly enough of it to spare for a fleet of mid-ocean airfields. Something else is needed, something that does not compete with steel production, something that can be built quickly and in enormous size. Pyke, an eccentric and brilliant combined operations scientist working under Lord Mountbatten, proposes an answer so strange that most people who hear it assume he is joking. He is not. What follows is one of the most bizarre and genuinely inventive engineering projects of the Second World War, a scheme that reached the desks of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, consumed real money and real scientific effort, and very nearly worked. This is the story of Project Habakkuk, Britain's plan to fight Hitler with an unsinkable island of ice. Consider, for a moment, just how peculiar this idea would have sounded to an ordinary sailor in the Royal Navy at the time. Warships were made of steel plate, riveted and welded by the tens of thousands of tons, forged in the same foundries that had built dreadnoughts a generation earlier. The very language of naval construction was the language of metal: armor belts, keel plates, gun turrets. Nobody in the long history of naval warfare had ever seriously proposed sailing a fighting ship built from something that would, under the wrong conditions, simply melt into the sea it floated on. That so many serious people, from research scientists to the Prime Minister himself, entertained the idea for as long as they did tells you something important about how desperate, how inventive, and how willing to gamble Britain had become by the third winter of the war. To understand why anyone took this seriously, you have to understand just how badly the convoy routes were bleeding. By late 1942, Allied shipping losses in the North Atlantic were running at a catastrophic rate, with over 600 ships sunk that year alone, many of them in the mid-Atlantic gap that Allied aircraft simply could not reach. Existing solutions were inadequate, and everyone in the Admiralty knew it. Escort carriers, small converted merchant vessels fitted with flight decks, were being built as fast as possible, but they were slow to construct, vulnerable to torpedoes, and desperately needed elsewhere. Land-based, very long-range aircraft helped, but there were never enough of them, and the aircraft of the day simply could not loiter over a convoy for the hours needed to hunt submarines across such a vast expanse of ocean. What was needed was something like a permanent, unsinkable airfield that could be towed or steamed into the middle of the gap and simply parked there, refueling and rearming aircraft indefinitely. Steel could not deliver this at the scale required. Britain's shipyards were already straining under the demands of building destroyers, corvettes, and merchant tonnage to replace what the U-boats were destroying, and naval planners calculated that a conventional steel carrier of the size being discussed would consume a full year's worth of the country's steel plate allocation. That was simply not going to happen. The challenge on paper looked impossible. Build something roughly 600 meters long and weighing well over 1 million tons, able to survive torpedo hits, able to operate heavy bombers, and able to do all this without using the one material every large warship was traditionally made from. There was also the matter of time. Even if the steel could somehow have been found, conventional shipbuilding techniques meant years between. The laying of a keel and the commissioning of a working aircraft carrier, and the Admiralty did not have years. Convoys were being torn apart in the here and now, in the winter of 1942 and the spring that followed, and any solution that could not be delivered quickly was, in a very real sense, no solution at all. This was the atmosphere in which Combined Operations Headquarters, an organization created specifically to think laterally about the war's most stubborn problems, began looking seriously at materials nobody in naval architecture had ever considered before. It was an organization that had already backed several unconventional schemes, from specialized landing craft to portable harbors, and it had cultivated a culture where an idea was not dismissed simply because it sounded absurd on first hearing. That culture is precisely what allowed Pyke's proposal to survive its first, entirely reasonable, wave of ridicule. Geoffrey Pyke had spent years cultivating a reputation as an unconventional thinker, and in this case, unconventional was exactly what was called for. He had read about experiments from the 1930s conducted by a Brooklyn-born inventor and by researchers investigating how to reinforce ice for use in cold climate construction, and he seized on the idea that ice, properly reinforced, might do the job steel could not. Pure ice is brittle and shatters easily under impact, which is why nobody had ever seriously proposed building a warship out of it. But when a scientist working with Pyke at the National Research Council in Canada, a Czech-born biochemist named Max Perutz, who would later win a Nobel Prize for his work on the structure of hemoglobin, began experimenting with mixtures of ice and wood pulp, something remarkable emerged. The wood fibers acted like reinforcing rods embedded in concrete, holding the ice matrix together and dramatically increasing both its strength and its resistance to shattering. Pykrete, as the mixture came to be called in honor of Pyke, could absorb the impact of a bullet without cracking, melted far more slowly than ordinary ice, and could be molded and repaired simply by pouring more slush over damaged sections and letting it freeze. The scale of what Pyke proposed was staggering. Project Habakkuk, named after a line from the Old Testament about a work being done in your days that you would not believe even if it were told to you, envisioned a vessel roughly 600 meters long, 90 meters wide, and displacing somewhere in the region of 2 million tons, dwarfing anything else afloat. To put that in perspective, imagine a structure roughly the length of the Empire State Building laid on its side, floating. Its hull, made of pykrete reinforced with an internal skeleton of timber and steel piping, was to be up to 12 meters thick in places, thick enough that engineers calculated it could absorb a torpedo strike or an aerial bomb without sinking. Keeping the ice from melting even in warmer waters required an internal refrigeration system, effectively turning the entire vessel into an enormous cold store with a network of brine-filled pipes running through the hull connected to refrigeration plants and the ship's own insulated outer skin further slowing the thaw. Perutz himself worked from a secret laboratory beneath Smithfield Meat Market in London, chosen precisely because its existing refrigeration units could keep experimental pykrete samples frozen, testing how the material behaved under stress, how quickly it melted at different temperatures, and how it could best be reinforced. The manufacturing process, as far as it was ever worked out in detail, would have looked utterly unlike any shipyard Britain had ever operated. Rather than a slipway, engineers envisaged something closer to a vast open-air ice factory, with layers of wood pulp slurry sprayed or poured into enormous timber molds and left to freeze in stages, each layer bonding to the one beneath it, gradually building up a hull many meters thick over a period of months. Canada, with its abundant timber, cheap wood pulp, and reliably cold winters, was the obvious place to attempt this at scale, and it was Canadian engineers and construction workers, alongside British scientists, who carried out the most serious practical trials. production numbers for a genuine operational fleet were never fixed with any confidence, since the project never reached that stage, though early planning documents floated the idea of building several vessels if the concept proved sound, a figure that shifted constantly as costings came in and enthusiasm within the Admiralty rose and fell. A scaled test vessel, roughly 18 meters long and 1,000 tons in weight, was built on Patricia Lake in Alberta, Canada, disguised as a fishing lodge to keep prying eyes away, and it demonstrated that a Pykrete hull, kept refrigerated, could hold its shape through a Canadian summer. Proponents calculated that the full-sized Habakkuk would need a compressor and refrigeration system roughly equivalent to that found in a small town's ice-making industry, running continuously, along with a propulsion system using multiple electric motors housed in external nacelles rather than a single engine room, since nobody had ever tried to bore a conventional propeller shaft tunnel through a hull of reinforced ice. Estimates for the workforce and materials required were sobering. Some projections suggested that building even one Habakkuk vessel would consume a significant fraction of the wood pulp needed for other wartime industries and would require thousands of workers laboring for the better part of a year, and this was for a single ship. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Because Habakkuk was never actually completed as a warship, there is no dramatic account of it hunting U-boats in the mid-Atlantic Gap, and it is important to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise. What operational history exists is confined almost entirely to the test vessel on Patricia Lake, which functioned as a proof of concept rather than a fighting ship, and to the wind tunnel and stress tests carried out in Britain and Canada on sample blocks of Pykrete. Workers on the Patricia Lake site, most of whom were conscientious objectors assigned to alternative war service, spent the winter of 1943 hauling timber, mixing wood pulp slurry, and monitoring the internal temperature of the growing hull, all under a veil of secrecy so tight that many of them had little idea what the strange, ever-thickening structure they were building was actually for. Visiting engineers reported that the completed test hull held its shape remarkably well, that a small ice-making plant kept its core reliably below freezing even as the surrounding lake warmed through the summer months, and that samples cut from the hull retained the toughness observed in laboratory tests months earlier. Churchill was reportedly delighted by a demonstration in which a block of the material shrugged off a pistol shot, while a corresponding block of ordinary ice shattered, and the concept was presented to Allied planners at the Quebec Conference in August 1943, where combined chiefs of staff discussed it alongside more conventional wartime priorities. What the surviving records make clear is that enthusiasm for the project, while real, was never universal, and that as 1943 wore on, the practical objections mounted faster than the engineering solutions. Compared with German efforts, there was frankly no equivalent. Germany never pursued anything resembling an ice-hulled vessel, relying instead on conventional steel-hulled aircraft carriers such as the never-completed Graf Zeppelin, and on the U-boats themselves, whose effectiveness was precisely the problem Habakkuk was designed to counter. The comparison that mattered more was with the alternatives being pursued simultaneously within Britain and America, namely escort carriers and long-range aircraft. Escort carriers, such as the Bogue class, built on merchant hulls, could be produced in a matter of months rather than years, and displaced a mere 20,000 tons compared with Habakkuk's proposed 2 million, a difference of roughly 100-fold. Very long-range Liberator bombers, once properly allocated to Coastal Command, closed the mid-Atlantic Gap through sheer range rather than through any exotic new material. In the end, it was the unglamorous solutions that won the Battle of the Atlantic, not the visionary one, and by early 1944, Allied shipping losses had fallen dramatically as escort carriers and long-range aircraft, alongside improved radar and code breaking, closed the gap Habakkuk had been designed to fill. It is worth noting that Habakkuk was never truly copied by anyone, in the sense that no other nation attempted to build an ice-hulled vessel of its own, though the underlying idea of a composite ice material proved durable enough that variants of Pykrete were quietly investigated again decades later, this time for entirely peaceful purposes such as constructing temporary ice platforms in the Arctic and Antarctic for research stations and exploratory drilling, where the same properties that once promised to stop a torpedo turned out to be equally useful for supporting heavy equipment on otherwise unstable ground. The historical impact of Project Habakkuk is therefore almost entirely conceptual rather than material. No Habakkuk vessel ever sailed into action, no enemy submarine was ever sunk from its deck, and by late 1943, the project was quietly wound down as the strategic picture in the Atlantic improved and the sheer resource cost of building even one ice ship became impossible to justify against more conventional priorities. Yet the scheme mattered in other ways. It stands as a striking example of the sort of unconventional thinking that wartime desperation could produce, and Pyrute's work on Pykrete, though it never built a warship, contributed genuinely useful scientific data on composite materials that influenced later research into fiber-reinforced ice and cold region engineering, ideas that would resurface decades later in discussions of ice runways and ice platforms for Arctic research and oil exploration. The psychological effect, such as it was, existed only among the small circle of planners and scientists who briefly believed Britain might field a fleet of unsinkable ice islands, rather than among any enemy who never learned the project existed until long after the war. Today, the clearest physical trace of the project lies at the bottom of Patricia Lake in Jasper National Park, where the timber framework and refrigeration piping of the test vessel, its ice long since melted away, still rest on the lakebed, a curiosity for scuba divers rather than a monument to victory. Return for a moment to that freezer in Brooklyn, to the axe bouncing off a slab of frozen wood pulp while a British scientist smiles. That single image contains almost everything you need to know about Project Habakkuk. Audacious, faintly absurd, and rooted in a genuine scientific insight that nobody had thought to apply at this scale before. It was never going to sail. The maths, in the end, simply did not work, not because the material failed, but because the sheer quantity of labor, refrigeration, and wood pulp required to build and maintain a 2-million-ton vessel of ice outstripped what even a nation at total war could spare for a single, unproven ship. And yet it was not a folly in the way that word usually implies. It was a serious answer to a genuinely desperate problem, pursued by serious scientists, tested rigorously, and abandoned only when better answers arrived first. There is a temptation, looking back from the comfort of the present, to treat Habakkuk purely as a curiosity, a wartime oddity fit only for a footnote or a pub quiz question. That temptation should be resisted. The scientists who worked on it, Pyrute's above all, were among the finest minds Britain had, and they did not waste 18 months of a desperate war on a project they considered frivolous. They tested it rigorously, subjected it to genuine scientific scrutiny, built and monitored a working prototype through an entire Canadian summer, and only abandoned it when the numbers, not the concept, made continuation impossible. That distinction matters. Habakkuk did not fail because ice could not be made strong enough. It failed because no nation, however desperate, could spare the labor, the timber, and the refrigeration capacity to build a fleet of vessels on that scale while simultaneously fighting a war on every other front. Habakkuk asked a strange question and, for a while, took the answer completely seriously. Could you build a warship from something so fragile it melts in your hand, so ordinary it falls from the sky as snow? The answer, it turned out, was yes, you could, at least in principle, on a small Canadian lake, in a laboratory under a London meat market, in a Brooklyn freezer where an axe kept bouncing off a block of ice that refused to break. What defeated the idea was not physics. It was logistics, timing, and the arrival of solutions that were merely good enough, delivered faster. In the story of the Second World War, that is often how the strangest ideas end, not with failure exactly, but with being overtaken by something duller and more practical. Britain never got its ice aircraft carrier. What it got instead was proof that, in the depths of a desperate winter, its scientists were prepared to consider absolutely anything, however impossible it sounded, if there was even a chance it might save a convoy, and that willingness to entertain the unbelievable is, in its own way, as remarkable as the material itself.